You can see on your panel screen that I've got two other guests with me here today. And my guests today are Scott Foote, who is the CEO of Fortinium, and Jerry Brucho, who is the CISO for LogMeIn. And today we're going to talk about a very interesting concept of leadership and cyber risk intelligence. Now let me just get started. I'm going to give Scott and Jerry a minute to introduce themselves in a second, but I just want to get started by laying the foundation for how this topic is really coming to bear. We all know that much has been said about leadership and risk. In fact, Scott Zuckerman has often been quoted as saying that in today's changing environment, the greatest failure of any organization is not taking risks. And I know that's easier said than done in many cases because the risk-reward dynamic has the added component in today's environment by which risks rapidly emerge and have impact on our organizations. So leaders today really have to deal with the ability to make decisions at the speed of risk. And in order to do that, leaders are going to need risk intelligence, particularly in this area of cyber, where risks are constantly changing and constantly evolving around threats, vulnerabilities, and consequences. I think in order for leaders to be able to have risk intelligence and be able to make decisions at the speed of risk, they have to have four key traits. They have to be risk aware. That is to say that they have to know what risks are out there and what the potential consequences of those risks could be, given their vulnerabilities as an organization and given the context within which they operate. They have to then be risk intuitive. They have to sense the risks that are out there and be able to constantly understand how those risks are changing. They have to accept the risk. They have to be willing to recognize that risk is a part of life, risk is a part of business, the business world today, and it's not enough just to hope that it goes away. And then with those three traits in place, they need to have risk courage. That is to say, maintaining a healthy respect for risk, and then be willing to take action, making decisions, using risk intelligence to develop options so that they can take action and manage their risks. Scott and Jerry, again, welcome to our show today. Really great to have you here. I'm broadcasting live today from Southern New Hampshire University from the Sandbox Collaborative in Manchester, New Hampshire. Scott and Jerry are in two other parts of the country. I know, Scott, you're a little bit closer than I am, and Jerry, you're farther away. I'm going to let each of you introduce yourselves, tell us where you're broadcasting in from, and just give us a brief snippet of your background as we get into this topic today.
Sure. Thanks, Kim. I'm broadcasting from the home office today, and I spend a good deal of my time working from this space when I'm not on the road. My background in information security, so I was an operating system engineer, process control engineer, and a database internals engineer prior to 1995. Information security, as you might guess, was tangential to all of that. We paid attention to it, but it wasn't an independent science. It wasn't until 1995 I got into it on the vendor side. I joined a startup called OpenVision, and I was responsible for their security products organization, products and services. We had a variety of different tools, familiar security controls today, but at that point in time, these were all emergent. We had a vulnerability auditing tool, one of the leaders in the space, with the reference implementation of Kerberos for an authentication capability. We were working on a distributed authorization capability called Gatekeeper. We introduced one of the first security event managers in that time, and even started to secure technologies, like we had the first reference implementation of the secure RPC, as well as a secured backup product from one of our sister organizations. But even at that point in time, the threat was not high, the sense of risk was not high. It was a very difficult market. Having been in that vendor space for a while, selling the controls and tools, eventually I moved into the cyber threat intelligence space, what we call cyber threat intelligence today. At that point in time, we really didn't have a market name for it. But we spent time watching the adversaries and learning, getting into their environments, and basically building dossiers on their behavior, campaigns through capabilities, all the way down to understand their maneuvers. Eventually that brought me into more of the consumer side. So I switched sides from being the vendor to being the actual user, and I spent a decade with the federal government helping their information security managers do a better job of using the controls, better jobs of monitoring, using controls and making decisions about how to defend their environments. That brought an observation, which is really what we're talking about today. There was a significant market vacancy in terms of the ability for these managers at all levels, tactical, operational, and strategic, to build the context that they needed to make their decisions. Lots of raw information, lots of raw tools, but it wasn't being integrated. So a year ago, I left that side and came back to the vendor side. We founded Pertinuum, and this is the space that we're addressing today with both products and services.
Outstanding. Outstanding. Thank you, Scott. Thank you so much for that great introduction. And that's an awesome home office that you have there. That's definitely Risk Intelligence Central. Jerry, where are you calling in from? And give us a little bit about your background.
Sure. I'm calling in today from our lovely Santa Barbara offices on the West Coast. The weather is not quite where I would hope it to be, but it's looking like the fog is lifting later in the afternoon, so it should be beautiful and sunny. Thanks a lot, Kim, and thanks a lot, Scott, for inviting me on this panel. I'm really excited to be here and trying to share a little bit from what I've seen throughout my career and in my current role. So I recently joined LogMeIn as the CISO. LogMeIn, as some of you may know, is a software as a service company for a number of different products in the IoT space, in the collaboration space, in security space through LastPass. So we have a large variety of products and services that we offer to customers across the board. And obviously in this kind of context, securing those kind of services and making them available in a form that protects our customers' data is absolutely critical for the success of the company overall. I started my career at Sun Microsystems, working mostly on security interoperability. There were lots of changes in the late 90s and early 2000s in terms of getting the various operating systems and infrastructures work together in a secure manner. I've been working in that space from an R&D perspective for quite a while, gathered a lot of information about how the security systems are actually built, how they work together, and what needs to be done in order to deploy them in a kind of a secure manner across a large variety of different use cases. Then, similar to Scott, I switched to federal government work. I was essentially building and architecting the security infrastructure for a number of large operation centers across there. So definitely started to utilize and cherish the value of intelligence that it can bring to creating a proactive and a very agile kind of defense environment across the board. That took me throughout a couple of years, and then I joined a company called Demandware, which was a emerging software as a service company mainly for retailers. So we operated the web front ends and later also point of sales terminals for vendors. That was during the times where Target and Home Depot made the headlines of the Wall Street Journal. So a lot of activity, a lot of attention from various different stakeholders in that process were definitely presenting themselves, and again, the ability to better understand our own environment, and then also to better understand what the threat landscape looks like and how that translated ultimately into a sound assessment from a security and risk perspective was absolutely crucial in terms of managing the program within the budget allocated, but also to the expectations of our customers and our stakeholders in the company. That ultimately brought me then to LogMeIn, where I'm right now, essentially building that for, as I said, a large variety of products. Thanks for having me.
Oh, thank you so much for being here. So for those of you that are online, and we've got quite a large audience out there, I can see we've got at least 50 participants that are logged in. You should have a Q&A folder down at the bottom of your screen. You should also see a chat box. So if you want to post a question or make a comment throughout, I'll be watching for that, and I can certainly bring your comments in. I'll also ask for any questions or comments at the end. We have set this up as an interactive discussion today with my two panelists, and if you haven't figured it out, so I kind of come in from the perspective of leadership and kind of laying the foundation for why risk and risk intelligence is an important topic for leadership. Scott is really helping us think through risk intelligence from a cybersecurity risk perspective, and he's going to offer us some really interesting insights about how this all comes together conceptually. And then Jerry, with his CISO background, is going to share with us throughout the discussion today a number of ways in which he's seen leaders apply or not apply risk intelligence to be able to make good decisions across the spectrum of risk. So with that, Scott, we'll just start with you. I gave a little sneak peek of this slide previously, but give us your sense, your insights as it relates to leadership and risk.
Thanks, Ken. When we first started talking about the theme for this webinar, I spent a lot of time reflecting on lessons learned in the 90s while I was doing tech due diligence for some VCs in the investment community. This was where I really was forced to get out of my technical track, having been a software engineer prior to that, and pay attention to what made leadership, what made leaders successful. So as we would go in and do due diligence, of course, we're reading source code, we're testing product, we're really kicking the tires on the technology. But one of the things that we were asked to do was assess the leaders on how comfortable they were making decisions, how comfortable they were on gathering the information within the constraints presented to them, time, money, whatever was available in terms of information, and then making the risk along the 4 vectors, making the decisions about that risk along the vectors that you talked about earlier. That was an eye-opener for me. I confess I'd had some management training as a first-line manager, but it was a different point of view to be looking at an executive team and assessing their strengths and weaknesses as a potential candidate for investment or even an acquisition. So when we reflect on that, there was, of course, the whole spectrum of skill sets. Folks that would just shoot from the hip, that wouldn't gather information. There were folks that would just completely stall, never feeling they had the perfect information, wanting 100% accurate intel. And then the folks that were comfortable managing in that domain space, creating order from the chaos, but making the decision when it was important, when they needed to move forward. The worst leader, I think, is one that doesn't make decisions at all. Someone who simply doesn't move forward. I've made those mistakes in my career as I got into a more senior leadership position, just not feeling comfortable with the environment yet. So we talk about that information, we talk about it as being context. As I start to talk to leaders now, senior leaders in the cybersecurity space, I find many of them are experiencing a sense of urgency. That's a given. We all know that the threat has really materialized. But it's not always an excuse for not doing your homework. I also find folks are impatient. The number of times people will say to me, maybe not as recently in the last year, but prior to this, you don't understand. You don't understand. I very much understand the threat you're facing, and I understand the cascading consequences. Jerry's spoken to just a few of the public incidents. These are a weekly event now. But we still need to make informed decisions as leaders. So when we go and look into the cybersecurity space, what type of information should those leaders be after? What are the decisions we ask a CISO, a CSO, even a CRO to make? It all comes down to mitigating risk for the business. That is their job one. As I engage with folks, we talk about decisions about risk. Risk is a very abstract, very subjective thing. So let's try and make it a little bit more concrete. For over 10 years now, I've been using John Boyd's OODA loop model, the next bill. That OODA loop model tries to get the leaders to recognize that there is a discipline to making decisions. You're making observations in the space. Maybe your staff is, maybe you're bringing that information in from external sources. You're using it to orient yourself within the context of the decision space. You're making decisions, or you're bringing the appropriate stakeholders in, the folks with the appropriate authority if it's not yourself. And then ultimately you're acting or directing someone else to act. It could be your staff, it could be a vendor. This loop is often ignored. This is where people don't spend enough time on the upper 2 categories. They want to go directly from observe to act, again, because of the sense of urgency. That's not a bad thing. When we don't need that external context, when the situation is familiar and it's a commodity, we can act. When we understand the response, we understand its effectiveness and its potential impact itself on the organization, you can short circuit that loop. We'll speak in another slide or two on automation, but I've seen too many leaders get into this role and their first reaction is, I've got to be a firefighter and go right from observe to act, and they get themselves into trouble. the spectrum of decisions we're talking about, I'm using mostly reactive decisions here, but the next build will speak to proactive decisions. What are the policies that aren't in place and need to be there? What are the controls we don't have in place? Right down to where are we monitoring today and where should we be monitoring to better improve that information. And I must confess, coming into Protinium a year ago, this third decision space was not something I expected to be spending the majority of my time on, but I must speak to 2 or 3 CISOs a week about their challenges communicating to stakeholders, to their C team, to their board, and ultimately, usually through some type of a rep, communicating to the customer base publicly. Most of us are technologists. Our gut is to just bring in a pile of statistics, all the raw data, and dump it in front of our consumers. I don't think that's leadership. It's important to present the information, but what's more important is to present the context. For the CISO to go in with a business situation, we have a problem or I anticipate a problem. This is what we need in order to address it. Finances, resources, timeframes. To frame it like all the other executives frame it when they come in to that boardroom, to have that high-level leadership discussion.
Absolutely. Great point. I'm going to turn it to Gary here for a minute as we take a closer look at this observe, orient, decide, act cycle, and using that as an ability to help mitigate risk and walk through that to be more proactive. Gary, how do you see this really playing out in organizations where you've worked as a CISO? Do you see organizations doing what Scott suggested more often than not, which is go directly from orient to act and ultimately being very reactive with regards to risk? And how have you tried to guide more organizations to work through the observe, orient, decide, act, and become more proactive and develop more effective reporting capabilities as a result?
Thanks, Ken. Thanks, Scott. Yeah, I think this is very pertinent to my position at LogMeIn right now, because as I indicated earlier, I just recently joined, so I am in the process of observing or orienting and trying to understand our overall security posture better before I want to make decisions. So I feel that throughout my career, but also throughout my tenure in the industry, I've seen successful companies definitely follow this kind of model, either implicitly or explicitly. Calling it out explicitly, I think, really helps to pace yourself. I feel the same kind of urgency, the same kind of impatientness that Scott was talking about when I get presented with a new situation that could be challenging or that could present the company with some unmitigated risk or some problematic environment. But really going through all the steps in the loop and first observing what is working, what is not working, then truly orienting oneself and starting to prioritize in terms of like what to tackle first, and then leading to the decision and the acting. That really makes a program more successful. That it allows much more efficient allocation of resources across the board, and also then ultimately for us to derive the kind of KPIs, the kind of key performance indicators that we do need in order to report out on how effective the spend and how effective the allocation of the resources in the security program actually is for the overall security posture of the company. So I can definitely relate to this a lot. As I said before, I've seen many successful organizations really do this explicitly or implicitly. I've seen less successful organizations that do try to jump between steps, go from observe to act, or from observation directly to decision, and really face those kind of challenges that lead ultimately to fighting fires on a constant basis, versus really being able to plan ahead and ultimately create a midterm or long-term strategy that is agile and adaptive enough in order to truly address not only the current crisis, but also plan for the future.
Yes, very good. So we'll get into more of those examples here in a few minutes, but Scott, back to you. I mean, if it is really the case that it's not enough just to have situational awareness, we've got to be able to develop this contextual reasoning. I think it makes sense to me that we have to understand more about what that risk really means. So how do leaders understand risk? What is it about risk that we need to understand?
And I've seen this from GRC conferences all the way down to just sidebars and roundtables. Risk is a 4-letter word. That's not my quote. I've just heard it so many times I felt I had to share. because it's very abstract, because it's very qualitative. So how do you transform it into something that's more quantitative, more concrete, that has addressable components? So in 1995, when we were in that startup trying to sell security controls, security management tools, we went in and sat down with folks and we built a mental model. We called it the risk formula, and many people like it, many people hate it today. But the risk formula, the next build on this slide, is not actually an arithmetic formula, right? It's not meant to be something used mathematically. It is simply a mental model that allows us to separate risk into some fundamental components. The first, most obvious, being the threat, to be able to enumerate what the threats are. In 1995, the threat was not very sophisticated. We're all familiar with folks like the Cult of the Dead Cow, right? And Loft and other organizations. The threat was there, but there wasn't a high degree of probability or likelihood in it manifesting itself. The vulnerabilities were what we focused on, assessing them with vulnerability auditing tools and then addressing them, either reconfiguring or fortifying, minimizing the attack surface with better things like authentication that was more defensible. Today, we see more and more energy being invested on the consequence vector, because you can't tell the difference between a match and a forest fire without this idea of consequence. What is the business impact? You can't rack and stack situations, whether they've been experienced or whether you're just forecasting and building to plan for them. You can't tell the difference without this idea of consequence. So these fundamental pieces were very, very important as we started to say to our customers, and now today to CISOs, where do you make your investments? How much energy do you invest in understanding that adversary? You could spend every day, all day, reading about threat intelligence. It's a wonderful space now. There's so much available. But does it make you any more informed about your decisions? You can spend all your money driving your vulnerabilities to zero. We're still going to wind up with compromises. Understanding that context of consequence is so critical to making these decisions.
Absolutely. What do you think, Jerry? And how do you see this risk equation, this risk conversation being carried out in organizations? And what is it about this that might resonate with you or cause you to have additional questions?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as anyone who's undergone enterprise risk assessments, which typically, or in the past at least, have been in many companies more of a popularity contest, executives expressing what they feel the highest risk for their respective company looks like, and then ultimately condensing that down into a short top 20 or something like that it gets presented as part of the regulatory reporting. That is truly not very satisfying. And from an engineer or from a scientist perspective, I really feel strongly that this is not really a particularly useful approach to quantifying the kind of risk that a corporation feels. Taking the formula here and really understanding that consequence is ultimately a product of the potential impact and the likelihood with which that impact actually occurs. That really takes it into a domain where you can start attributing actual loss values or dollar values to the ultimate risk. It is still to some extent a gazing into the crystal ball and trying to understand what that ultimately means, but at the same time it becomes an actually trackable metric that can be improved over time, that can be validated against the actual occurrences of impact or consequences that we have seen, and as such be used as a metric going forward that can be refined and ultimately be a fairly good indicator in terms of like the kind of expectations that we would have about losses, and then give us the right guidance as to how we would ultimately address those kind of risks or lower those kind of risks through the appropriate deployment of countermeasures.
Sure. Not every risk is going to necessarily be handled the same. I mean, I think it's safe to say, wouldn't you agree, Scott, that risk occurs across the spectrum?
It does. It's continuously changing with the threat spectrum itself. We have a tendency to talk about threat as just a word, or we talk about them as threat actors, which is a goodness, as opposed to where we were focusing 10 years ago on types of malware. Today, we look at a spectrum. But I don't think we spend enough attention recognizing the spectrum is continuously evolving, literally hourly. It's evolving. We talk about things like security automation. So we want to do the risk mitigation in real time to scale. We want to respond, observe, act, observe, act. Automation's a wonderful thing, but we have to acknowledge it's relevant at the right-hand end of this spectrum where the situations, the threats that are manifesting themselves are commodity threats. They're fairly well known, they're understood. Things like, distributed denial of service. We've seen this tens of thousands of times this year alone. There are some pretty standard stock responses that could be applied to that kind of a threat to mitigate the risk. So we program that into our infrastructure the best we can. But we have to recognize there's the implicit context. We already have the knowledge because it's a commodity problem. On the left-hand end of the spectrum, we have continuous new candidates entering, new malware and even new threat actors that are entering, that are constantly innovating. They have huge budgets and huge numbers of people available today. It is a business, and they innovate continuously. That novelty is where we want our tier one, certainly our tier two, if you've got tier three analysts, that's where we want their brain power invested in that novelty space, because we need human inference. This is where we need to do intelligence collection. This is where we need to look at things from 2 or 3 different perspectives, not simply read it out of an intelligence stream or a feed, but engage with the adversary and learn about their operational behavior, their tactics, techniques, not just simply recognize the malware. This is a problem that we're running into today where we burn the tier one analysts out on the right-hand side playing whack-a-mole. That picture deliberately looks like a whack-a-mole picture. That's what too many of us have spent our time doing. We want them shifted to the left, and we can invest in our software assets on the right-hand end. In the middle, we talk a lot about machine learning. The idea behind machine learning, I think, is obvious to most folks. It's where the decisions are pushed down into the software, but the software can't be pre-programmed. It needs to build heuristics. It needs to actually mimic the human inference to make decisions, to base its decisions on. The point about the slide is really that it is a very continuous spectrum. It never ends. This is not something, as one person said to me a few years ago, when are we going to get on top of this? When are we simply going to drive all of this threat down to zero? And I said, well, we aren't. The mafia still exists today. The Yakuza still exists. The Russian Bratva exists. These organizations have existed for generations, and they will continue to exist as long as the opportunity produces a financial gain. In this sector, we're seeing the exact same thing. As long as opportunity presents itself, we will continue to see the novelty and the threat will evolve.
Right, right. So leaders have to make those informed decisions based on a clear understanding of risk being, as you said earlier, a function of threat, vulnerability, consequence. Some of that will happen at a higher frequency than others, but in order to really understand how we're going to focus our attention, we should start with a clear understanding of that broad spectrum of threats. Some threats being more commodity now because we've seen them before, we understand them fairly well. We're going back to my earlier points, very aware of them and can therefore develop these sort of automated responses to the threat while we save resources or save energy to focus on those new threats that are continuously evolving that we don't quite yet thoroughly understand or can intuit. And therefore, in order to be able to deal with them, we've got to have resources to work through that and change those into time through machine learning into this more automated mode that we can then plan for. Gary, I would ask you again as a CISO that practices this kind of approach every day in dealing with threats, many of those threats being very commodity threats you mentioned earlier. How do organizations from an information security perspective organize their resources and their level of effort across this spectrum? Do you figure out ways, and what are the best practices you've seen to apply security against those commodity threats while still saving resource and saving some of your capacity? Who do you have available to work the novelty threat?
Yeah, no, very good question. And it's, I mean, we've been mitigating commodity threats for a very long time. Initially through simple devices like firewalls, then more recently through more advanced endpoint protection, through more advanced monitoring systems and alerting systems that do lend themselves quite nicely to security automation, either fully automated or largely automated, so that mitigating a DDoS attack or similar kind of activities, as long as they don't exceed certain boundaries, is something that is a little bit cumbersome, but ultimately quite a manageable problem overall. Obviously, anyone working in security is most interested in the novelty threats. That's exciting. That's like hunting down a threat actor or trying to understand what they do. And so being able to play in that space is definitely very rewarding. But at the same time, I would make a point that not necessarily all organizations are truly facing extremely advanced novelty threats overall. I mean, they're definitely out there, and you have to definitely make sure that you do understand what your potential exposure to those kind of threat actors or groups are. But at the same time, having a balanced approach to address the whole spectrum, and also include some of those middle of the road kind of threats that Scott calls phenomena, I think is just as important as being able to track some of the most advanced threats, because these are just more likely. It's these are the type of threats that are essentially presenting themselves to you through a much more advanced level of attacking, whether it be through social engineering, whether it be through semi-customized malware. So the standard simple tools and appliances that you find on the commodity side really don't work as well or at all in this kind of space. So having the ability to have your team look at the entire spectrum itself, and then really try to figure out how to address each one of them in the most appropriate way is super important in terms of like maintaining a balanced kind of security posture across the entire range here. It is challenging because while as I said, it is interesting and exciting to work on novelty threats, and maybe not quite so exciting to work on some of the lesser ones, we just even wouldn't have the necessary amount of resources in order to be able to address all of that through manual labor. So security automation and machine learning are starting to become very much a critical component in the overall ability to maintain a security posture across the entirety of the spectrum.
Outstanding. So even a company like LogMeIn, a collaboration company, you're seeing this full spectrum of threats that you're having to deal with on a regular basis.
I'd be shocked if not pretty much any company that has any kind of resources on the internet would not be seeing the entirety of that spectrum in some form or another. Obviously, if you're a very small mom and pop shop that operates a single small retail portal, you will not be having state actors necessarily targeting you, although even that is not really clear depending on what kind of business you're in. So I would say you see a very wide spectrum, since the attackers definitely have also understood to leverage automation and really scale their type of attacks across a large variety of targets. It is something that you see more and more often.
So where do leaders begin, Scott? What do they do? What questions do they ask themselves to get started?
Well, where do they begin is with context, right? Context is everything to inform these decisions. Just a quick observation on this slide. Many of us don't, I don't know, maybe more and more folks understand this today than perhaps a few years ago, but we don't acknowledge the fact that the adversary throws a lot of the commodity stuff at us deliberately to keep our tier one analysts busy, to keep our infrastructure busy, to keep our analysts busy while they are playing a card that maybe we've never seen before. They understand that they can eat our resources by throwing a lot of the low-end commodity things. We see a lot of very old malware attack techniques still rampant on the internet. Maybe it's by some low-end player that's not very experienced, but more often than not today, it's noise designed deliberately to distract the finite resources we have defending the organization. But back to the contextual picture, understanding that context is important. As I've been speaking with folks over the last decade or more, They said exactly that. Where do I start to build context? I said, you start by asking questions. And we enumerated all manner of types of questions for them. And ultimately, it comes down to what I call the 5 what imperatives, is a simple mnemonic for this. But we start with, what should I be watching for? In my domain, not in anyone's domain, in my domain, what should I be watching for? And will I know it when I see it? Those are the basics of the indicators of attack, indicators of compromise, maybe behavioral patterns, TTPs. But ultimately, I want to make sure that I'm looking for the right things. Far too often, I come from the security event manager space, and I used to pull in every single beep, squeak, and whistle, and it created too much noise. I wasn't being selective about the data that was being pulled in and presented to my tier 1 analysts. Can we do a better job of deciding what to monitor? When an event does manifest itself, can we then answer the next question, so what? Back to the matchstick and the forest fire. Can I tell the difference? Can I turn this into a statement of impact to the business? And do I know which rabbit to chase down which rabbit hole, rather than chasing everything? And then, of course, none of these incidents are in an isolated state. They're all part of the kill chain that an adversary is exercising against you, their target. Can you put that event in the context of what else the adversary is doing? We're getting better at this. Certainly from the folks that I'm working with, their staff is getting better and better at this as they spend a little bit less time running down that commodity rabbit hole and more time looking at their adversary as what they are, a group of motivated individuals. So now that begs the question. We've got a little bit more context. What do we do about it, right? What now? Now what options are available to me? I've got a red pill, a blue pill, and a sugar pill. What's the appropriate thing to do, not just in terms of the technical nature of the problem, but in terms of the business context? I knew someone who basically ran into a problem and she isolated her network, she pulled the plug, everything was wonderful. Very legitimate problem, by the way. This was a sophisticated nation state actor. She isolated the network and she took her users offline in a mission critical environment that had global implications. She didn't have the context. Maybe it would have been better at that point to provide her with other options. How do I keep them in situ? Do I need counterintelligence against this adversary? Is this a law enforcement situation? Do I need to continue to gather evidence? Do I need to maybe feed them disinformation? What's the broader engagement look like? Rather than spitting on the match, if I have more of that context, I can assess what the appropriate option is. And the last piece is really understanding what if, looking over the time horizon. This could be what if the threat materializes, or it could be what if I played my blue card versus the red card? What is the impact to my business? Is my impact going to be worse than what the adversary is producing right now? It's a higher level of decision making than most of us are used to or comfortable, because we've been in that high urgency, high frequency, engage, firefight mode. But the adversaries that we're dealing with today, they're playing at the strategic level.
Very interesting. Occurs to me as you're talking, and I'm sure others will appreciate this. These questions are not new, right?
Correct.
Questions that business leaders have been asking themselves forever. And the fact that we're asking them now with regards to cybersecurity just, puts an added point on where some of the challenges are. But the questions of, what is a potential risk or what is a potential concern is a question that every leader needs to ask themselves that runs any kind of a business. And so what, the potential impact of that would cause them to think about, well, what do I do about it? Or what's my vulnerability? Where am I potentially weak, right? And then what else might this be a part of? If I'm vulnerable here, what else could I be vulnerable to? You're thinking more broadly, more strategically, which then drives us to certain controls. And again, business leaders have all kinds of controls in the cybersecurity world. And somebody is just making the comment here online. Thank you very much. I see our audience is sharing that this whole conversation orients a bit around the idea of managing and matching risk to the assets that I have and the context within which those assets exist and the importance of those assets. And then the controls that we're going to place against those assets to better deal with the risk. Our specific understanding of what that risk is. So what about the risk relative to our assets? and then our ability to apply controls so we can deal effectively not only with the specific threat, but all the other aspects, the larger potential context within which that threat is being applied, and then continuously understand the possible what ifs where this could go. So great comment from our audience talking about threats, assets, and controls as it relates to this slide. But these are fundamentally business questions. And Jerry, over to you again, CISO. So are CISOs having conversations with business leaders? Are business leaders getting it that, what imperatives are business questions? Do you have to do a lot of translation along these lines of these what imperatives, or to our commentary from the audience, threats relative to assets and controls? Do we get lost in that conversation?
I think we may have gotten lost in the past, but I think we're getting overall much better as an industry around those. I mean, this kind of tree and asking the what imperatives is something that is definitely an exercise that anyone who has worked in a security operations center or has been dealing with crisis response overall is used to. I mean, we are really trying to understand what is happening, what else could happen, and how can we mitigate. So the overall flow of that questioning is definitely something that in the security world we have been used to. We have been able to start to be good about this from a reactive perspective. But I think we're now really at a inflection point where this is really starting to become more and more important to not only look at this through the rearview mirror, but also look at this from a strategic planning perspective. So instead of just trying to understand what is the crisis du jour and how can I mitigate that, we're really starting to ask those questions proactively across the board, looking at like the caller was saying, across all our assets that are relevant in a particular delivery context, and starting to plan ahead and really be proactive about that. That can be done through the line of questioning in here, especially when it's aligned with exercises or tests, and then ultimately fed up into the executive and corporate leadership level, so that they understand based on simple KPIs where we stand today, where we should go, and what the overall strategy of the company should look like in order to be able to have the right security posture. And just from that perspective, it's been really interesting, specifically with the last job that I held, where the core value, the core goal for the company was to grow fast, because we were starting off in a space that was not really crowded from a competitor perspective in SaaS retail world. So being able to grow extremely quickly, extremely fast into this kind of world and capturing a lot of market share from on-premise solution was really critical for the overall success of the company. That didn't mean that we de-emphasized security, but at the same time, we definitely made some decisions slightly differently and approached the overall way in terms of like how we solve some of these risk problems in a different way that we would have done if this has been a long-established 50,000 person company with a broad installed base. So being able to really adjust your overall strategy and align that with the business requirements and the overall corporate strategy, I think in this context is extremely important. And only by walking through those kind of steps, you can really start to understand this and then properly align this across the board.
Outstanding. Great comment about this being a framework for not only dealing with a tactical threat and risk, but also being able to use it as a framework for strategy development over time, and using this kind of information to help inform strategy. Which takes me back to you, Scott, again. What do you see leaders needing to do next with this information?
So it's helpful to have a framework. We can organize our chaos, but at some point we actually need to go do the real work. And Jerry's already referred to quite a bit of the stuff that he's done in the past, putting the pieces together, understanding your assets, vulnerabilities. That's really what we're talking about, is a comprehensive integrated view of risk in your cyber domain. The next slide speaks to 7 vectors, 7 general categories, as a mnemonic, as a mental model that we see folks wrestling with today. To some extent, very well. To other extents in other categories, maybe not as robust as it could be. But we start with the fundamental understanding of ourselves. What are the assets we have? What are our own networks? I think any organization, even down to the mom and pops, maybe they've outsourced it to an MSSP, but they should be continuously scanning their environment. They really should do as much work to know themselves as their adversary does. The first thing that I would do on a red team, for example, to open up your organization would be reconnaissance and get behind the perimeter and simply enumerate what's there to understand those assets. The second function, this isn't news to any of us, is vulnerability auditing. Let's go look for the soft spots that could be targeted. The third that we've seen more and more of an investment in over the last 5 years has been a structured understanding of the threat actors. Who are they? What do they do? How do they do it? Can that teach me to better train my monitoring, humans and actual technology, to look for the phenomena? That's the fourth category there at the top of our crystal ball, the phenomena themselves. I don't think any organization is at a loss for alert streams pouring into their environment today, tens of thousands sometimes on an hourly basis for even a modest-sized company. But back to the point about the match and the forest fire. How can you tell the difference without the consequence piece? We really need to be able to bring the consequence intelligence in right to the tier 1 analyst so that they don't have to play Apollo 13 and scramble and ask people about anecdotal expectations or interpretations of the environment. They have at their fingertips the ability to say what business, what lines of business, what customers, what senior leaders are impacted by this type of an event. That should be presented immediately. And with that, we should be presenting options. What are the options? Now, maybe they're not going to be decided upon by the tier 1 analyst, depending upon the event. But to present the options immediately, not simply tear it down to bare metal and rebuild it, but what is the blocking and tackling that's available, and have we vetted it? Have we used it before? How effective is it? And then back up to consequences. If I take the red pill, it will get rid of the adversary, but it's also going to get rid of my users. To put that in every single one of the decision makers' hands. At any level, the decision needs to be made. And lastly is this temporal comprehension. The number of folks that I engaged with, again, this is maybe a little dated 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago, that their concept of time was on the millisecond because the digital bullets were flying. And I used to make that example. You're in the DMZ and somebody shoots at you, you're not going to dodge the bullet. You need to think about the adversary. If someone's going to take a shot at you, that person has a campaign. They're targeting you, they do reconnaissance, they pick a time. Point is, you need to think like the actor thinks in the longer time scale. Down to the millisecond point, we emphasize a lot the fact that too many people trust the time of their own environment. And again, as a red teamer, that's one of the first things that somebody would tweak is distort your perception of time. All of these are potentially available sources of information. It's all there to be fused by the analyst and by your senior decision maker into context. Context is everything to support the decision space. So one of the things I'd throw out there just as a challenge for some of our audience as we're winding down is an exercise. Take these 7 categories and grade yourself on a scale of 0 to 5 to see what your investment looks like today. Even if you're not fusing it, are you at least gathering this? How is it gathered? Is it manual? Is it automatic? Are you getting your intel from a single source? Are you pulling it in from 3 or 4 different types of data feeds and blending it with an analyst that knows how to assess what's relevant to you? This has been an eye-opening exercise for the few folks I've done this with to get them to look at their own context that they build. Of course, this is the space we're bringing products and services to market in, but fundamentally, we need those senior leaders to do that introspection, to bring that introspection into the environment and make a decision how much of an investment do they need to make to build out the broader set of risk intelligence.
Great challenge, Scott. Really interesting way to kind of lay out these 7 vectors and think about how they apply to a specific organization. It's interesting that this particular profile that you've put together really tends to orient to the left-hand side. Is this what you see, Jerry? If you were to take Scott's challenge up, do you see more of an orientation towards the left-hand side of these 7 vectors of risk intelligence, and how do organizations get over to the right side?
Yeah. I think it's first of all, I'd like to point out that this model and the having 7 vectors here explicitly spelled out, I think is a really insightful approach in terms of like separating a little bit the marketing fluff that various parts of the security industry have been thrown at us over the last couple of years. I mean, when we talk about cyber intelligence, many times it's really only been threat intelligence. And people have started to buy lots of sources for threat intelligence and making them available internally, without ultimately being able to really contextualize it, like Scott said, in the context of their assets or their vulnerabilities, etc. So I think the left side, as we see there, that we have had much more information and systems and automation available for a long time, right? I mean, asset management is something that hopefully every company has a pretty decent handle on, and it is driven by some of the underlying financial requirements. So from that perspective, it's not really surprising that there's a lot of emphasis on that side. Similarly, vulnerability intelligence, vulnerability management systems, scanners, both network-based as well as host-based, have been around for quite a while now. I think it's a fairly mature market, and any kind of larger organization has started to roll out some form of vulnerability program in terms of self-assessment or external assessment about their environment. As you move around the clock there from the left side to the right, I think it is an astute observation that the ability to ultimately operationalize the intelligence you've gathered from different sources is not really as effectively deployed across organizations as we would like them. So as you mature your security program and as you go through improvement steps across the board, I think this is a really interesting area to focus new investment on, and really also assess how a more effective use of the intelligence gathered on the left-hand side can ultimately lead to better decisions and a broader decision space on the right-hand side. Again, from a SaaS company perspective, we have production networks, we have corporate networks. In the production space, if there's a significant risk to the overall environment for the company, we have a large variety of potential actions that we can take, from blocking individual IP addresses to putting up additional firewalls, additional packet inspection, etc. Ultimately to shutting down the entire grid, right? I mean, this kind of decision space is wide, and if you do decide to go down one path or another, obviously the corresponding business risk in terms of like discontinuing a service or interrupting a service can become fairly high. Having the right tools and having the right context available to really make a sound judgment with regards to whether it is the right decision to pull the plug or to just block individual or threats at a more granular level, I think that is really critically important, especially when you are in the crisis of the moment and you have to decide within a very short period of time how that particular risk presents itself to your overall enterprise objectives. So yeah, I like this kind of approach quite a bit. I do agree that the security industry as a whole has not necessarily given us as many nice tools to automate things on the right-hand side, and it would definitely be worthwhile to getting that in order to be more agile and be able to quicker respond to emerging threats or threats that do on the spectrum lie more towards the middle of the left.
Great. I was going to ask you about tools, so thanks for sharing that. Scott, I have a question from the audience. They're asking about the temporal comprehension point that you were making, and how do organizations use temporal comprehension to assist them in the ability to develop or decide on options?
So the simplest example is the correlation that we do in basic tools like a SIEM. I correlate events across multiple components of the infrastructure to get a better picture of the complex event that's unfolding. Better example, though, at the most strategic level is to put that in terms of the engagement with the adversary. How many times have we seen the adversary do this? What's the frequency the adversary is performing this on? I think a lot of folks that have spent time sitting in the tier 1 analyst or tier 2 analyst chair begin to see a typical pattern of behavior from the professionals. We see times of day, we see durations of the engagement, we see how much effort they're putting into a particular task. We see how much effort they spend in terms of extracting certain data, searching, and then digging further for something of interest. And then we see them begin to unfold their tool set as they bring in more advanced capabilities, assuming they've actually got a foothold in the environment. If you can begin to put that picture together of the adversary's engagement and not focus as much on the discrete events, on the sheer white noise, if you can find the signal in all that noise, and I'm not talking about all of your resources, but certainly a tier 2, tier 3 analyst, your SOC director, manager, if they can spend their time not worried about the noise, but worried about the few named actors that are continuously engaging with them and putting together a picture of the conflict with that adversary. We know adversary XYZ, let's call them the Lazarus group. We've seen Lazarus here 7 times over the last 6 months. This is what their particular interest is. This is how they've been playing capabilities. And this is the change we've seen in their tactics over the last 2 months. That's a more strategic picture. It's more strategic context, and it better informs what we're going to do to mitigate the risk from that actor. The temporal comprehension being important to think in terms of calendars, not in terms of milliseconds at that level. You can't ignore the fact that the adversary is playing a chess game. This isn't simply a series of bots that are bombarding you with, SIM flood attacks, right? That's a tactic at the lowest level, but someone turned that bot on you. Putting that picture together is often difficult. It really does require investigative analysis. It requires a set of tools. There's no one-trick pony. There is no single silver bullet. It requires the discipline with the skilled players as well as the enabling capability that lets them put that picture of conflict together.
Great. Thanks, Scott. Thank you for that answer. I'm going to wrap this up for us. This has been really a great conversation here today. Leadership in today's environment where organizations are trying to digitally transform themselves inherently means that they're going to take risks. And because they're taking those risks to go through a digital transformation, there's going to be cyber risks that they're going to have to mitigate. We've heard today from Scott as he's laid out for us, this risk formula is really a function of threats, vulnerabilities, and consequences. And those threats exist across the spectrum, from commodity threats that we can understand a little bit better, we're more familiar with, and we've got security automation to deal with them, to more novel threats, new threats that we've got to devote perhaps more attention to with security analysts and automation, to Jerry's point, to address those as they continually evolve and innovate. And in the middle of that, phenomena from which our machine learning can help us to better understand. So leaders in making effective decisions today have to confront cyber risk and have ways to mitigate it across that spectrum. They need to be able to make decisions in each of those aspects and go from being reactive to more proactive as they think through this, and then provide effective reporting of that using the information that's available that comes to them from the continuous asking of these kinds of 5 what questions that Scott put in front of us. What, in fact, is the threat? So what about it? Where am I vulnerable relative to my assets? Our audience member helped us think through that framework from the threat asset controls perspective. What else could be happening that I need to think about in the context? And now what do I do about it? What controls do I put on it? And what if, over time, things continue to emerge? How am I going to respond? Because this may be one of those novelty threats, or we may still have to continue to work through this as things change. So asking those questions helps us make decisions to be more proactive and can help us develop good answers along this cyber risk intelligence set of vectors about our assets, our vulnerabilities, our threats, and the nature of them, such that we can posture ourselves more effectively to deal with phenomena that emerges, consequences and the relative importance of those, and the options that we have available to us within a temporal context or considering the time context. All of this, I think, gets leaders to the point where they can be risk aware that the risk exists, risk intuitive, being able to now sense, going from just knowing that it's there, knowing what our assets are and the potential vulnerabilities, to being able to preempt and anticipate what those risks are through intuition and gaining that intelligence over time. And therefore being very much risk accepting the fact that the risk is there, the threats are there, we understand those actors, we can deal with the commodity kinds of threats that occur, and we can plan for and program for and strategize for the larger ones, and therefore have options such that we can have risk courage and make effective decisions. I want to thank Scott Foote and Jerry Buchelt for joining us here today. You guys have been awesome. What a great panel of thought leaders in risk and risk intelligence, and having applied a lot of these concepts in the organizations where you've worked. I want to thank our audience members for your participation. This information is going to be is currently being recorded, and we'll make it available to you shortly after today's session. Thank you so much for being here, and we'll see you again on the next session.
Thank you,
Thank
Kate.
you, Tim.
Thanks, Scott.
Bye, everybody. Have a great day.
You too. Bye-bye.